In every major sport, there is always that one franchise, or in some cases multiple franchises, that always seem to be the butt of every joke in their respective league for all their missteps, failed trades, botched free agency signings, and season after season of perpetual losing. And it seems like no matter what they do, even when it finally seems like they might be trending in the right direction, it all comes crashing down yet again. And when it comes to the NBA, no team can be more obvious when it comes to being one of the most poorly managed franchises in NBA history, and that is the New York Knicks, an organization that since the year 2000 has won all but one playoff series win in 22 years. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy the content, then consider subscribing, as this is a newly created channel, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this all season long. Now, I know right off the bat some will say that how can I criticize the Knicks for all of their failures over the last 2 decades when I'm a Bulls fan? Like, the Chicago Bulls have been right up there in terms of being one of the biggest laughingstocks of the NBA ever since Michael Jordan retired, and you're gonna make fun of the Knicks after the way the Bulls have been performing so far this season especially? And yeah, I'm fully aware that the Bulls have had their fair share of issues and have been a disaster more often than not in recent years, and I've definitely critiqued the team and franchise a fair amount on my main channel, Bulls Central, but the fact of the matter is the Bulls, for one, have actually won more than just one playoff series since 2000. In fact, they have won quite a few, and during the D Rose years, they actually went to the playoffs 7 straight seasons with a record of 500 or better for 9 consecutive seasons, which the only other team to do that in that time span was the San Antonio Spurs. So a bit of context is important, but yes, I fully acknowledge that the Bulls have been a joke for a number of seasons since MJ retired, regardless of their mild success during the D Rose era. The Sacramento Kings have also been historically bad and currently have the longest playoff drought in the NBA. The Minnesota Timberwolves are right up there, as well as the Orlando Magic, but at the same time, there are also, these teams anyway, are smaller markets that make it much more difficult to consistently produce winning teams, competitive teams, when they are in a less desirable market for top level free agents. But even despite the lack of success from teams like the Kings, the Wolves, the Magic that I just mentioned, they pale in comparison to that of the New York Knicks, especially for a franchise that is the biggest market, sports market in the country, and I'll explain why. Aside from what I mentioned of the Knicks having won one playoff series since the year 2000, they have only reached the playoffs all but 5 times alone in that 22-year span. And since the 2013 playoffs, the last time they won a playoff series, they have been to the playoffs just once in that last decade, and with just one playoff game win to show for it. One playoff win in what will be 10 years by the time we hit the playoffs this season. But I think the question is why? Why have they been so bad throughout all of these years? Like, yes, they haven't won a championship in nearly 50 years, but even in the 90s, they were a good team. Those Bulls-Knicks rivalries were some of the greatest battles in sports at that time, and honestly, had it not been for them running into Michael Jordan so many times in the playoffs in the 90s, they likely would have taken home a title at least once, and they did manage to make the finals twice, both times after Michael Jordan retired, once in 1994 and then again in 1999. So they had good teams those years. I don't think anyone would deny that. But why have they been so bad entering the new millennium? What is it about this franchise that has made it so depressing to be a Knicks fan? And it starts with all of the awful decisions they have made over the years, where even the casual NBA fan cannot understand what they were thinking. Here are some of the transactions over the course of the Knicks history that have been absolute disasters in setting their franchise back for decades. They signed Vin Baker to a fairly sizable contract in 2004 after he was already starting to decline. They made a big trade to get Steve Francis from the Orlando Magic, who was also on the decline and experiencing injuries when they made that trade, was well past his all-star days, and they traded a very young Trevor Ariza and Penny Hardaway to get him. Hardaway was whatever because by that time he was already washed, but Ariza would later go on to become a very impactful role player, ended up winning a championship with the Lakers a few years down the line. They then traded Steve Francis the following year after they realized it was a mistake in taking on his contract and just his overall attitude and approach to the game, with Channing Frye, who was their lottery pick from just a few seasons prior, for Dan Dickau, Freddie Jones, and Zach Randolph, which the only one who actually meant anything in that trade was Zach Randolph, who they didn't even end up keeping beyond 1 year and traded him away for parts, while Randolph later on went to become an all-star. They selected Danilo Gallinari with the 6th pick in the 2008 draft, but later traded him away with a ton of players and draft capital for that big Carmelo Anthony deal, which, by the way, one of the first-round draft picks that they actually traded to the Nuggets for Carmelo Anthony ended up becoming Jamal Murray in the 2016 draft. Of course, the big 2010 summer free agency bonanza, which featured the likes of LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, which most Knicks fans, even the general media at large, felt that it was a foregone conclusion that LeBron was going to be a Knick, that the biggest star in the league was going to be on the biggest stage and bring a title to the Big Apple, until he didn't, and neither did the other big names. So the Knicks had to settle for giving out a max contract to the tune of 5 years, $100 million to Amari Stoudemire, which didn't seem like a terrible consolation prize at the time because Stoudemire was coming off an all-star season in Phoenix, was playing some of his best basketball, and in that first season with the Knicks, he was still playing very well, putting up 25 and 8, was selected as an all-star. But then the injuries started, and Stoudemire started on the decline, never being the same player after that, and eventually became a liability for the Knicks. But unlike some of the other players the Knicks traded away way too early before they managed to become impactful players on other teams, the Knicks were never able to move Amari and eventually waived him on the final year of his deal in 2015. But honestly, the most egregious and worst contract that the Knicks have given out over the last 2 decades was when they signed Joakim Noah to a 4-year, $72 million contract in the summer of 2016. And look, I love Joakim Noah. As a Bulls fan, he is one of my favorite players of all time. I loved his hustle, his tenacity, his grit, how he got the team and the crowd hyped and energized. Wasn't the most athletic player, wasn't the most gifted when it came to his shooting, to say the least, but I don't know how the Knicks could not see that Noah clearly was already becoming a shell of himself by the 2015-16 season. Anybody who had watched even a handful of Bulls games that season knew Noah was declining rapidly, and it's why the Bulls had no intention on offering him an extension going into that offseason. But for some reason, Phil Jackson thought Noah was still that all-star, that defensive player of the year that he once was when he signed him to that massive deal, and right away, literally within the first few weeks of him being in a Knicks uniform, you knew this was a mistake. Noah went through injuries, couldn't rebound like he used to, couldn't block shots like he used to, was horrible at finishing around the rim, and eventually was waived by the Knicks 2 years into his deal, and they had to stretch his contract over a number of years to still pay him his guaranteed money. And then more recently, the contract extension they gave both to Julius Randle and RJ Barrett, which I get to an extent. You kind of had to give out these extensions, especially after Randle basically outperformed in a contract year and then, of course, fell off after he got his bag, and now they're tied to his contract for the foreseeable future. And then RJ Barrett, I like Barrett. I actually think he's better than people give him credit for. But they didn't need to extend him this past offseason and could have allowed him to become a restricted free agent and let the market dictate his value and just match whatever offer he received if they truly wanted to keep him. But 4 years, a little over $100 million for a guy who is very inconsistent and inefficient on offense, and more recently his defense has also started to decline a bit. Just seems like this is going to be another regrettable contract down the line, yet is going to constrain them in terms of their cap space, especially when they also signed Jalen Brunson to a massive deal, which I like Brunson and felt he was one of the more underrated players in the league last year, but you're paying Brunson all-star level money when in reality, he's not going to move the needle all that much for your team in taking the Knicks to the next level and being a championship contender. And when you look at the trio of your 3 highest paid players with these contracts in Randle, Barrett, and Brunson, and taking up the majority of your salary cap for the next 3+ seasons, that core doesn't spell title contending team. I don't even know if one would consider this to be even a second round level playoff team. The other piece is the Knicks draft history, in that they have been historically bad at drafting the right players, and even when they do draft the right players, they end up trading them away for less than their overall value, like when they traded Kristaps Porzingis for DeAndre Jordan, Wes Matthews, and Dennis Smith Jr., all of which didn't even last on the team beyond 1 season, and then they also included 2 protected future first-round picks in the deal. Now, Porzingis maybe in hindsight was the right move to trade him, considering how many injuries he's gone through since moving him, and because he's also hasn't really been the best teammate and is still far from his lone all-star season, but he's still a solid player and far better than what the Knicks got in return. And here are the other draft picks over the years, with most of these being in the lottery. Jordan Hill, they drafted 8th overall in the 2009 draft, right before DeMar DeRozan, also before guys like Drew Holiday, Jeff Teague. Frank Ntilikina, 8th overall in 2017, ahead of Donovan Mitchell, a guy they really wanted to make a trade for this offseason before the Cavs swooped in to get him, also ahead of Bam Adebayo, John Collins, OG Anunoby, and then of course they drafted Kevin Knox, 9th overall, who some in the Knicks camp felt that he was going to be a Kevin Durant light, when in reality he became a Kevin Durant zero and has been one of the biggest draft busts in recent years, and they drafted Knox ahead of guys like Mikal Bridges, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and Michael Porter Jr. Then of course in 2019, when they were tanking for Zion, they got unlucky by landing the number 3 pick, which netted them RJ Barrett, who has been a decent player but not better than some of the guys who went after him, like Darius Garland, Jordan Poole, even Tyler Hero. And then they drafted Obi Toppin in 2020, who has been fairly underwhelming for them and also doesn't really fit Tom Thibodeau's style of play with heavy focus on defense. And look, I know drafting and looking at players and how they perform relative to where they were selected after the fact is always a hindsight is 2020 moment, but at the same time, it's one thing to have a failed lottery pick here and there, but to have it happen consistently, season after season, with really nothing to show for it, is really more of a sign of poor management. And that kind of leads me to my point of all of this and why the Knicks have been one of the biggest laughingstocks in the NBA for the last 2 decades. And it's because they are so poorly managed, starting at the very top with James Dolan, who has no idea what the hell he wants with this team. He brings in new executives, tries to make shifts and changes in the direction of the franchise, and then quickly pivots to another direction. It's why you see the Knicks making big moves and then quickly doing an about face and changing course. They make trades for what they think is going to be a franchise cornerstone, all but to trade said player the following season. Or they draft players who are expected to be that piece that they're looking for in bringing the franchise to relevancy, all but to trade them in a package before they reach their true potential. And then they end up paying the wrong players to large contracts and often hold on to them in the hopes that they turn things around instead of cutting their losses when the player still has some value. The New York Knicks are quite possibly the most indecisive franchise in the NBA. They can never pick a direction for where they want to take their franchise and just stick to it. And honestly, until Dolan decides to sell the team and let someone else take the reins who can actually hire a competent front office and know what they're doing, I really don't see things changing for the Knicks anytime soon. Let me know what you guys think. Do you see anything changing for the Knicks to actually have them become a relevant franchise in the near future? Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.